Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Today, we have another report from Prairie, Canada. The waterfowl hunting season is well underway up there in Canada. It's getting underway here in the States. Of course, non-residents are still not permitted to, or at least not easily permitted to enter Canada for the purpose of hunting. And so we're clamoring for information out of the prairies. What are the duck numbers looking like? What are the hunter numbers looking like up there? We've heard from Scott Stevens on a couple of these already. And we have an opportunity here to connect with another one of our guests from a previous episodes, Pat Kehoe, Ducks Unlimited Canada's Director of International Partnerships. Pat, thanks for taking the time to join us here on the podcast.
No problem. Glad to be here.
I'm going to jump right in. And I know when we last spoke, you were mapping out some of the hunting that you were going to be doing over the subsequent weeks. And I think that was going to be, leading into the opener there in September. And I know those dates have now passed. I know you have been out. You have been chasing birds. And so I want to just ask you, let's back up to the early part of that hunting season. I think you were going after cranes, sandhill cranes to be exact. How did that go? Were you successful in your pursuit of those birds?
Oh, very much. The sandhills were great this year. We hunted central Saskatchewan, area that's major crane staging area. We did very well on sandhills for the Labor Day weekend and went back at them sort of in mid-September, and they were still there in big numbers. And we had some great sandhill hunting. We started hunting them over decoys in the last few years. Up till now, I've been a pass shooter, but about 4 years ago, we got a decoy spread. And tell you what, sandhills over decoys are a lot of fun.
You went exactly where I was going to, because we spoke with Scott Stevens about that. He typically does some pass shooting, and that's the only way that I've ever done it. Scott was telling us about his experience hunting over decoys and how exciting it was. And so I'm going to have to get up there and try that at some point. So you too then have moved from pass shooting to hunting over decoys. What about crane calling? I have to go there also. Do you use a crane call, or do you just try to get to where they want to be?
I don't have a crane call, but what works well is for me anyways, is just a white front, a speckle belly call, and doing a trill through the call, make that bugling sound of the crane. That seems to work just fine, get their attention. Once you get their attention, they're locked on the decoys. They just quiet down, and they tend to come right in.
Yeah. I think Scott is a bit challenged in his ability to trill as ours, so he just kind of flaps his gums, from what I understand. Tries to make an appropriate sound.
I believe it.
Yeah. Okay. So you did well on cranes, and then I think you took a bit of a break. What was your next outing? What did you get out and do thereafter?
Yeah. Well, the next round was mid-September, about the 20th of September, so late September, I guess, mid to late September. We went after snow geese and white fronts, and focused on the geese. We did well on cranes again, and we didn't have huge success on the snow geese. We did well on the white fronts and sort of central Saskatchewan, a little west of where I normally hunt the cranes. But snow geese seem to have had a really poor breeding year. There's very few young in the flocks, big flocks of adult birds, and just very difficult to decoy. So we switched back to pass shooting on the snow geese, and did pretty well a couple of times on pass shoots on snow geese. But tough year for snow geese over decoys, just not a lot of young. Now, having said that, we've also had very open weather in Canada up to this point. It looks like it's going to start to freeze the end of this week, but we haven't had those flocks, large flocks of snow geese come down. Generally what happens with snow geese is the first flocks that come down into Prairie, Canada are adults and failed breeders. The young follow later on. So there may have been a bit of two things going on. We're a little early given the weather for big flocks with young in them, but it didn't seem like there was a lot of production going on from what we saw. Now, the specks, on the other hand, when we got into them, they were looking pretty good for numbers of youngs in the flock, and we did very well on specs for 3 days over in central western Saskatchewan.
That's good to hear. I want to follow up a bit on that kind of production outlook for the snow geese. The birds that you would be getting there in in Prairie, Canada are going to be from the mid-continent population of snow geese. We have to remind folks that there's also a western population over in Wrangel Island up off of Russia, and then to the east you get into some of those the greater snow geese mostly the farther east you go. And so the only birds that you're able to kind of speak about right now with respect to what you're seeing in terms of recruitment would be the mid-continent. I did see a report, I forget where that was, something encouraging. I think it was an encouraging report with respect to production out of Wrangel Island, and I haven't heard anything out of the east. Do you have any insights on either of those areas?
I don't. With the pandemic, the COVID, most of the researchers weren't able to work in the Arctic this summer. So, my normal contacts that would have spent the summer in the Arctic studying nesting geese and doing banding weren't up there. So we don't have any good reports. All we're relying on is sort of the weather reports. And it sounds like most of the Arctic was a late thaw, which equates to poor breeding generally across the board. But like everything else, I'm sure there's pockets up there that were conducive to breeding. So depending on where you're at in the flyway and where the birds are coming, you may experience a little better hunting than I did on snow geese. But generally the central Arctic birds in Saskatchewan, from what I saw anyway, had a very poor breeding year.
And I think about the only source of large-scale data collection to help us draw some more confident conclusion on production out of the mid-continent is going to be coming from the Canadian Wildlife Service and some of their surveys there on the staging areas. I think I spoke with Frank Baldwin a month or so ago, and he said they were planning on conducting those surveys. I believe those surveys if they haven't been finished, they're underway, and they're still trying to do some data summarization. But we'll connect with Frank or someone else up there here in the coming weeks and see if we can get, sort of put a bow on our understanding as best it is of what production out of the mid-continent might be, so our listeners can look forward to that. Hopefully, I can't promise that you're going to look forward to the results, but you can at least look forward to that report.
Yeah, I know there's folks from Canadian Wildlife Service out doing age ratios. That is, they're going out scanning flocks and counting how many young are mixed in the flocks and that sort of thing. So that'll be a bit of a different type of data than we've looked at in the past to get a handle on production, but it's I guess I'd have to say better than nothing. Yes. for in terms of forecast.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, it was encouraging news to hear that you've at least seen some good production out of white fronts, at least based on the flocks that you encountered. I think that'll make people excited. What else have you been able to do? It's been a while since we spoke, so have you been out to chase ducks at all yet?
Yeah, I've done a little duck hunting. I just spent the weekend in Manitoba here, put a couple days in at Delta Marsh, and there was not a lot of birds there. But again, with the open weather, all the small marshes and potholes are still open. The birds generally don't roll into those larger staging marshes to get freeze out. So it's pretty tough to give that as a good indication. Having said that, even though there weren't lots of birds around, we did some great diver hunting over the weekend. That area in central Saskatchewan that I did most of my goose and crane hunting in, very dry. Honestly did not see a duck hunting opportunity over fields in that area, which is unusual. I did do a bit of touring in Saskatchewan in the last 6 weeks, and you get up into the northern Parkland boreal fringe area. Water conditions are very good, and there was quite a few ducks up in that country. And as I mentioned earlier when we talked last, Alberta, particularly Parkland and northern Prairie, Alberta, are very wet. So there are areas where there has been good duck production, no question about that. But overall, I'd have to give the prairies of Canada sort of a less than average score for duck production this year.
How far south into Saskatchewan have you gotten? I know that was the area that was driest coming into the spring, probably persisted as the driest throughout the summer, and I'm guessing it's going to continue to be the driest. How far south there did you go?
Yeah, I drove our Trans-Canada Highway, which basically, if you look at a map of Canada, goes from Winnipeg right to Regina. So, and I went a little south of there just to see what conditions were. But it was very dry between Winnipeg and Regina, that southern Trans-Canada route. And it wasn't until you got north of Saskatoon by about an hour that you started hitting good water, and then Yorkton area and and even western Manitoba, north of the Brandon area. People may be familiar with Minnedosa, area where a lot of duck work has happened in the past. That area is fairly good too. So as I say, there's pockets that are gonna help keep the numbers up, but overall it's a little less than what we've experienced certainly in the last 10 to 15 years.
So Pat, what type of weather developments would or should we be hoping for to kind of help turn things around there with regard to drought conditions? Are we going to, what's the likelihood of getting any kind of precipitation between now and when things freeze up? And, just as a duck hunter and you having lived there for a number of years, what do you look for to help turn things around this time of year? Because what happens now can carry over and does carry over to influence the way things will shape up in the spring.
Absolutely. What happens in the next 6 weeks and really the next 6 months is critical to what things will look like next year. Ideally, I mean, if had your wishes as a duck hunter, we'd like to see some rain happen here in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So when it does freeze 3 to 4 weeks from now, the ground will be frozen, good frost seal. Then we need snow through the winter. And that when that snow melts in the spring, that frost seal will prevent a pretty major runoff, allow the potholes to fill up. And spring snow, April, May, May even here in Canada, snow early May is great for duck productions. That March, April, May period is critical. Usually that's when we get our deepest snow. It's cold up here in the winter, right? So when it's 40 below, you don't get a lot of snowfall. It's that spring period and early fall when we really get the snow up here that leads to runoff in the spring, that leads to good duck production. Having said that, if we get rain in May and June, that can certainly help things turn around as well. I've seen that a number of times on the prairies where things have been dry. You get a rain early June, ducks show up literally out of nowhere because it's been dry, and they will produce young. Not as good as if you have those conditions that line up with late fall rain, good freeze up, snow through the winter, and good runoff. That's the ideal situation. But there's still lots of hope between now and next year. We've got 6 to 8 months for things to turn around here, and they certainly can. We've seen it happen before, and we hope it will again. But as I said, the past call we had, drying these wetlands out is critical to long-term production. That is, if a wetland remains wet for 10, 20 years, its productivity goes down. You need those wetlands to dry out from time to time. So when the water comes back, there's good aquatic vegetation growth, good invertebrate production, good productivity, and that's all the duck groceries there that the ducks need to produce a clutch eggs and raise their young. So without that drying period that happens from time to time in Prairie, Canada, when we've got to suffer through slightly lower duck populations than we'd like, you're not going to have that high long-term productivity. So it's all part of a cycle that goes together.
Pat, we've talked about weather here a couple of times already. So kind of give us a good picture of weather conditions up there in Canada. What have they been over the past few weeks? What are they now? And what are they looking like over the next 7 to 10 days based on your forecast?
Yeah, it's unseasonably warm here, I would say. In fact, I mentioned the Delta Marsh. Friday, there was still a lot of blue-winged teal around the marsh, which is unheard of for the second week of October in Canada. As you know, teal season's open in the southern states in early September. Well, it's been warm enough that we still had good numbers of teal. A little cold front came through on Friday night, and sort of we lost the last of the blue-wings. But things have been open. We're not going to have much freezing till the end of this week. Past years, the past 2 or 3 years, heck, there was one year, I think it was 3 years ago, we had our first snowfall on September 16th, 17th. October 1st is not uncommon for snow, but at this point, we haven't seen any. Daytime temperatures have been 60 to 70 degrees. And nighttime has been running in the 40s to 50s. So we haven't had a major freeze up yet, which becomes problematic for us as duck hunters up here because we like those small wetlands to freeze so those birds start concentrating in the bigger water. And we haven't even seen that happen here yet.
And so then later this week, I think you intimated that there's going to be some weather coming in here pretty soon. What's that looking like?
Yeah, it's looking like we're going to have daytime highs in the high 30s, low 40s, and nighttime lows in the in the high 20s, low 30s. So we should have certainly those smaller ponds freezing up by the weekend. I expect bigger water is going to stay open because it has been warm. Bigger water, meaning larger marshes and lakes, will stay open for another 2 or 3 weeks if that weather persists. If it warms up again, all bets are off. I mean, I have seen open water here in Manitoba as late as the 20th of November, but that's rare. Usually we're frozen here pretty good by 1st of November. Halloween is sort of the end of the run generally for duck and goose hunting in Manitoba.
Yeah. And Pat, it just occurred to me, we are recording this on October 12th, Monday, October 12th. And so I have to say happy Canadian Thanksgiving to you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
It did not occur to me that we asked you to come in and record a podcast on what is a Canadian holiday. So, man, we owe you an extra kudos for your dedication to the podcast.
Not talking about ducks is like a holiday anyway, so what the heck.
Okay, well, that makes me feel better. Well, all right. So a little bit of a detour here then, considering that I just realized we have Canadian Thanksgiving going on. What did you have for your meal? Did you cook up one of those cranes?
I got a speck on the thawing out here for the grill tonight.
Oh, that's awesome. All right. Happy for you. Not so happy for myself. Haven't asked that question. Now I'm jealous. But I will say I did roast a hindquarter of a yearling deer here over the weekend. So that was not a bad alternative.
Absolutely not. We'll have deer season here in another couple of weeks, so got a bit of time for that to happen. But nothing like a hindquarter young deer.
All right, let's get back on track here. I'm going to make myself hungry. We the big question that we've had repeatedly on some of our conversations with you as well as Scott and others relates to. Of course, the continued closure of the border and what that is meaning has meant for the number of hunters on the landscape. I think some of us early on said, that's probably, you're going to see fewer hunters, but I doubt if it's actually going to have an effect on the migration, the rate and timing of the migration. Really need to look at weather patterns for that. And while weather pattern is always the key stimuli for influencing movements of birds as it interacts with the availability of food, what are you seeing with regard to hunting pressure, or maybe I should say the lack thereof, and how are your thoughts changing or recalibrating at all relative to the potential impact of that on waterfowl movement out of Canada this year?
This is certainly the least hunting pressure I've experienced probably in 30 years in Prairie, Canada. American non-resident hunters really started taking off here in the early 80s through the 90s, and recent years peaked and outnumbered Canadian hunters in Saskatchewan and I believe Manitoba as well. So the non-resident hunters up here really are a force when they're on the landscape. This year, of course, there's virtually none due to the border closure. I'm thinking, though, the weather patterns that we're seeing here, this wide open weather that we've had, is going to have a bigger impact on birds staying around than lack of hunters. It'd be hard to separate the two, I guess. But certainly, when I hunted in Saskatchewan, I ran into very few local hunters, largely on the weekends. There was nobody else hunting really through the week at all, which is very, very different. The area I hunt, I normally see 4 to 6 groups of Americans in the hotels, the restaurants, that sort of thing, as you're eating and in town for fuel and whatnot. None of that this year, which is also a very negative thing, obviously, on the local economy. Outfitters up here are hurting bad. The small restaurants and bars in Saskatchewan that rely on those non-resident hunters for a big chunk of their income for 6 weeks of the fall, it's just not happening. So there's talking to people in small towns, people are not really happy about the border closure and local economy up here.
Oh, I would imagine. Yeah, the economic impact on those small communities was certainly not lost on me as I started to think about that, knowing how we spend money every time we go there. We stay in some of those little rural communities and really enjoy the experience we have there. The people are always nice and accommodating, and they're more than happy to take our money. So they're certainly missing out.
Absolutely.
on that this year.
It's a big deal. I mean, You're in these small towns, they don't see very many people on a normal day. But when the hunters come to town, a restaurant that might have 5 to 6 people in it for breakfast normally would have 20 to 30, and that's a huge boost to the local economy.
No doubt about that. Pat, have you noticed any, and this is going to be hard for you to tease apart, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Have you noticed an effect on waterfowl behavior? Waterfowl in Canada are going to decoy readily anyway, but have you noticed any change in behavior of waterfowl or cranes as a result of the lighter pressure?
Yeah, well, absolutely. We talked about pass shooting, and certainly for cranes, a lot of people pass shoot cranes sort of as a pastime, secondary to goose or duck hunting when they're up here in the fall. That's not happening this year. It's not happening with pass shooting snow geese either. So birds are flying a lot lower. Pass shooting success this year was a lot higher for me than it has been in recent years when you have a lot of hunters in the area. Those birds just aren't getting educated to the same extent as they do in a normal hunting year. So from a selfish perspective, it's not been too bad in terms of success rate, but clearly there is a change in waterfowl behavior when you don't have that constant pressure. Snow geese were certainly easier to pattern because they're not getting bumped out of the fields like they would when there's a lot of hunters around, people hunting the fields that they were in the night before. They go set up the next morning. That isn't happening. So geese were using the same fields 4, 5, 6 days in a row till they ate them out. So yeah, there's definitely a clear behavioral response in these birds to lack of pressure.
Well, the silver lining to that might be that once those birds do cross over into the U.S., maybe they'll be a bit more vulnerable for some of the hunters here on the U.S. side. I do know I've heard of a few people, maybe more than a few people might be a fair way of saying it, that are planning a trip north into North Dakota and perhaps some of the other states up there. So maybe they will reap some of the rewards of some more vulnerable geese that are, whenever they come out of Canada.
Well, I certainly think there's going to be a difference how quickly they get educated with hunting pressure in North Dakota, because I understand it could be pretty high this year. We'll see, but certainly those first few flocks that come down have not been educated to the extent they might be in an average year.
Well, Pat, looking at my list of questions here, I think that about covers it. But what I wanted to do before we close out is give you an opportunity to share anything else that I might have missed that you think would be important to share.
Hopefully things will be back to normal next year, and a lot of your listeners will be taking their regular trips here north. Even though it's competition for me, welcome the company in Prairie, Canada, and it's certainly a place that I'd encourage most hunters to experience at least once in a lifetime, if not make an annual trip out of it. Hunting can be great up here when things are right. Unfortunately, this border closure has compromised a lot of individuals' ability to get up here, as well as hurt our local economies in the prairies and certainly the outfitting industry. So hopefully next year things will be back to normal, and we can talk again in a more normal year about what's going on in Prairie, Canada.
Yeah, no doubt. And I will say that has been pretty much the universal sentiment among the people that we've spoken with in Canada with regard to the effect of the border closure on reducing the number of non-resident hunters. It's from, like you said, from a selfish standpoint, you kind of enjoy the lack of pressure, but you also can sympathize with those hunters not being able to come north, and have always spoken very favorably about the prospects of returning to normal and seeing all those non-residents come back up there next year. And so with any luck, I might be among them. I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see how that goes. But Pat, that's going to wrap it up for us. Again, we thank you for sharing your time with us and your observations from Prairie, Canada, and good luck to you the rest of the season.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it. And hopefully we'll talk again.
A special thanks to our guest on today's show, Pat Kehoe of Ducks Unlimited Canada's Director of International Partnerships. We certainly thank him for his observations from Saskatchewan and Alberta and all the rest of the prairies. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the great work that he does on all aspects of this podcast. And of course, to you, the listener, you're the most important part of this effort. We thank you for your time spending with us, listening to the podcast, sharing it with your friends, and most importantly, your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.